finish off first a few things that we didn't have enough time to talk about last time of Karl Marx. And then we're going to move to Karl Menger. So maybe the most important thing that I would like to mention that we haven't covered last time pertaining to Karl Marx is his theory of the famous problem of transformation. Karl Marx never solved. That is eventually demise. Problem of transformation of exchange value, use value into exchange value. In other words, the problem of how to connect the labor theory of value with the tendency that we find on the market and that Karl Marx accepted as a fact, tendency towards equalization of profit rates. In different branches of production, in different branches of industry. That was a problem. And I will explain first where the problem comes from and why it's a problem and why it's difficult to solve it within the Marxian economic theory. And next time, when we read Eugen von Böhm-Bawerk, we will see how the problem is solved, actually. The criticism is that Böhm-Bawerk's criticism was the final nail in the coffin of Marxist technical economic theory. So you might get surprised how come that Karl Marx's theory became so dominant on the political left, became the basis for the communist movement in the 20th century. It was even accepted, I can tell you that, even by the Western social democratic parties. Until 1950s, it was officially accepted as their ideology. So for a very long period of time, you had this split in the international Marxist movement between communists, Bolsheviks, who were for the revolutionary change, revolutionary abolishing of capitalism, and you had those reformist parties on Western Europe who all believed equally in Marxist economic analysis, but they didn't want a violent revolution. They wanted gradual, step-by-step change. So, for example, German Social Democratic Party, by far the largest socialist party in the world in the late 19th and 20th century, when they abandoned officially Marxism? 1959. So that's not a communist party of Germany. That's a Social Democratic Party of Germany. Gerhard Schröder party, mainstream, Willy Brandt's party. They abandoned their congress at Bad Godesberg in 1959, small Alpine village, Marxism, and they accepted Karl Popper as the Open Society and Its Enemies, a book written by a famous Austrian, like an English philosopher of Austrian ancestry, Karl Popper. His book, Open Society and Its Enemies, which was highly critical of Marxism, accepted that as their official kind of ideological platform. The view of society and political philosophy espoused by that book is their famous book. So you may think, how come that Marx was so influential in the 19th century when his crucial theory, you'll remember the theory of exploitation of labor by capital. Exploitation. Did we discuss this last time? So the exploitation, the surplus value that is created by labor and that is appropriated by capital. That's the fundamental injustice of the capitalist system. And it's also, in the technical economic sense, the seed of the inevitable demise of capitalism. That's the profit rate. Tends to be equal in all branches of industry, but it tends to go down be reduced. The competition pushes pressure on profit rates. The profit rate goes down, and then only the strongest and the largest business firms can survive. Then you have a tendency towards monopolistic capitalism, towards concentration of property in the hands of a smaller and smaller number of people. That's a consequence of the internal logic of the capitalist system itself. So then as the profit rate goes down, capitalists have to exploit labor more and more. In order to stay in the business, you have to take from workers' wages more and more. What is the upper limit to how much they can steal from workers? Is the physical reproduction of the labor force. That's a criterion that both Malthus and Ricardo use. That's the wages, subsistence wages. That's the limit. So for Marx, this tendency of capitalism to reduce the profit rates that then lead to the cementing the wages at a very low level was an inevitable law of economic development. Capitalism was incapable of increasing wages of workers in the long run. So then it has to break down politically, because on the one hand you will have a smaller and smaller number of very wealthy monopolists, capitalists who control the entire economy, the 19th century version of the 1% propaganda of today's. And you have a 99% of people who are poor, either proletarians, workers. So proletarian means somebody, propertyless person, somebody who doesn't have anything else to sell but for their own labor, selling human labor. And you have ex-capitalists who join the ranks of proletariat, as Marx says. So those are the people who got obliterated through this competitive process in which bigger fish swallow the smaller fish. And the ex-entrepreneurs, capitalists, become propertyless proletarians themselves, and they join the ranks of proletariat, and they build up the class consciousness of the proletariats. And he says, the capitalist process of exploitation schools and trains its own what is the term he uses? Executioners. What is an even older term for a person who performs hanging or beheading? The guy who performs beheading. Executioners. What is the older term? He uses that. I know the Serbian term. Hangman. What else? So hangman. Yeah. Its own hangman. Yeah. So capitalist process schools and trains its own hangman. Hangman would be the proletarians who are going to politically organize and to destroy the entire system. So you have this idea of surplus value, that is this difference between revenue and costs that is appropriated by capitalists. You have one important distinction between fixed and variable capital. Fixed capital and variable capital. So by and large, Marx identifies variable capital with labor services. That's a quantity that goes up and down depending on the volume of production. Fixed capital, fixed investment goes in machines, tools, buildings, and so on. Physical capital. Now the key point arises here. So you have on the one hand the theory, labor theory of value. Things have value because exchange value, not use value. So he distinguishes sharply between exchange value and use value, as all classical economists do. So use value is why things are useful to us, why we want to consume. Exchange value is why things command market price. Exchange value is the market price. What determines the exchange value? So this is the labor invested into their own production. So then, the surplus value that capitalists appropriate is not appropriated for the services of physical capital. It is appropriated for the services of labor, variable capital. That's a very important technical point that Marx makes. Because labor is the source of value, the surplus value that is created in the process of production that capitalists appropriate. I pay you wages and I sell the product that you have made. If there is a positive profit, I appropriate it. That's a surplus value in addition to the value of your labor that I simply misappropriate for myself. That's exploitation of labor. And that is the value, the surplus value is created by variable capital. Now, what is the problem with this? The problem with this is that it conflicts with the obvious fact of the equalization of profit rates in all branches of industry. So Karl Marx accepted an empirical tendency that Adam Smith and Ricardo and Neil and everybody and his cousin already knew about, that there is a very powerful equilibrating tendency on the modern markets that the profit rates in all branches of industry would tend to equalize. The reasons for that are that if there is a higher profit rate in one industry, people will invest more there, and the supply of capital will increase, the prices will go down, the profit rates will go down. In the industries that used to have a lower profit rate, now the supply of capital will be short, the prices will start increasing. Since the supply has gone down, the profit rates will start going up and they will be then equalized once again. So capital is searching the areas of highest profit rates, and this capital market arbitrage creates a rough tendency for equalization of profit rates across the entire industrial structure. Profit equals surplus value. That's surplus value that a capitalist appropriates. Now, what is the problem here? The problem here is that you have industries that have very different structures, very different ratio of fixed and variable capital. You have labor-intensive industries and you have capital-intensive industries. You can produce any given good with the different kinds of combinations of labor and capital goods. Some industries are labor-intensive, they use a large number of workers and very few capital goods, pieces of machinery and equipment and physical assets, whereas some industries are very capital-intensive, use more capital and less labor. Marx knows that, everybody knows that, it's a basic fact of economic life, nobody denies it. What is the problem then? Can you see why is that a problem for Marx's theory? Profit equals surplus value. If the only source of profit is variable capital, which is labor, exploitation of labor is the only source of profit, then you would have expected the industries in which that are more labor intensive to have much higher profit rates. 70% of labor in your total assets, total capital, and 30% of fixed capital, your profit rate will have to be higher because the pool of workers whom you can exploit is much larger. Percentage of labor in your total production cost is much greater. So that means that the profit rates in labor-intensive industries should be higher, according to labor theory of value. There's no way around. And yet they're not higher. And Marx agrees that they're not higher. And this became a scandal, actually. This was very quickly realized when Marx wrote the first two volumes of Capital, and it became the so-called problem of transformation or a contradiction between the profit rate theory and the labor value theory. And Marx promised that he was going to solve the problem in the third volume of Capital. And everybody knew that he was writing the third volume. He never published it during his lifetime. He died in 1883. Here. So our friends can hear us, our friends online can see us. 1883, Marx dies. In 1891, I believe the third volume was published, or even later, during 1890s, actually. The third volume was published. Engels published it, his good friend, Friedrich Engels. And there was a major industry, or like a cottage industry of papers and articles and even books about how to solve this problem, this basic problem of Marxist theory. And Engels even created an international contest who is going to guess correctly Marx's solution of the problem of transformation. And then the third volume was published, and there was no solution at all. So that was the final technical, at a technical economic level, this was the final demise of Marxism. This key problem simply could not be solved. And the Marxists in the 20th century essentially gave up on the labor theory of value. They said you can still defend some of the fundamental Marxist philosophical and political claims, but without the labor theory of value, at least in the form how Marx formulated. One of the maybe apocryphal, maybe true stories is actually that Karl Marx read the book that we're going to discuss right now, which solved the problem of paradox of value and had shown why the labor theory of value and the cost of production theories of exchange value were untenable. That's the book, Principles of Economics, published in 1973. So he had 10 years. Read it. Grundsätze der Wissenschaftslehre, or something like in German, the Principles of Economics. The book is translated into English. Karl Menger. Actually, his original name is Karl von Menger. He was kind of a man of the modern times. He detested his aristocratic. He was an Austrian. He was born and raised in Vienna. And he deleted this von, this prefix von denotes like an aristocratic origins, like von in German, van. In Dutch, you still have the remnants of that. Marco van Basten, or whatever. This prefix van is still present. That's the equivalent of like Lord Lawson of Balby in British tradition. Denotes the type of estate or a noble family to which the guy belonged. So Menger simply rejected it. Many of the later Austrian economists, there's an entire school of Austrian economics, all of them had this one. Interesting. Eugen von Ben-Bauer, that's the guy whom we are going to read next. His immediate successor at the University of Vienna, Ludwig von Mises. I heard about that. Or Friedrich August von Hayek. They're all different. Hayek was a Czech. Like Hayek is a Czech last name. Mises was Jewish. That's interesting. His grandfather became a noble because he was a mechanical engineer and participated in building the railway somewhere in Eastern Europe. Menger and Ben-Bauer were like Austrians or Germans, or Roman Catholics from Austria. So people of different ethnic background. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was a multinational empire. So you'll see it among the leading Austro-Hungarian intellectuals or people, all kinds of different ethnic backgrounds. What all of them had in common was the German language. Franz Kafka, famous writer. He was a Czech. He was Hayek's compatriot. Hayek's family came from the city called Brno in today's Czech Republic, Moravia, Bohemia. Franz Kafka. Sigmund Freud was Jewish intellectual. Erich Fromm, another psychologist. Yeah. That was one of the most intellectually productive periods in human history. This intellectual scene in Vienna in the late 19th and early 20th century had given us, the Vienna circle in philosophy, Rudolf Carnap, Wittgenstein, Freud, then economics circle, Austrian economics circle, Mises, Hayek, Haberle, Machl, a variety of people. So Karl Menger was professor of economics. He was technically professor of law at the University of Vienna, and he published this book out of the blue in 1873 called Principles of Economics, in which he completely revised the classical. It was like a major break with classical economics. In the same time, the same year, another man in England will publish a book with essentially the same or very similar theories, independently from one another. His name is William Stanley Jevons. William Stanley Jevons. And the third one in Switzerland, Leon Valrat. All three of them published books in the same year, 1873, espousing essentially the same theory, subjective theory of value and marginal utility, or price theory based on marginal utility, that we're going to discuss on the example by using Menger as an example, because his writing style is the easiest of the three. It's the least mathematical and easiest to understand. Now, one more piece of trivia. It's not only trivia, it's important. There is a fourth man, who is the fourth independent co-discoverer of the marginal utility theory. That's marginal utility theory you will recognize now. If you read carefully Menger, you probably recalled microeconomics lessons that we read, marginal utility. That's the basic stuff now. That is the common wisdom in economics. There is the fourth man, fourth independent co-discoverer of the principle of marginal utility. He's an American. His name is John Bates Clark. He published the book Philosophy of Wealth in 1881, in which he co-discovered. He never read Menger or Jevons on Valrat. It's funny. 8 years later, he wrote a book in which he discovered essentially the same principle. So we will read John Bates Clark in a week or two. I'll give you like the exact proof of this, that he formulates the same principle, maybe more beautifully, more elegantly than either one of the three European masters. Same principle, marginal. So that shouldn't shock you. You have examples like that, independent co-discoveries or important scientific laws. You know any examples of that? Mathematicians should know. You should know about that. There are two guys in Europe who simultaneously discovered one important part of mathematical theory in the 17th century.
Was it pi? What, pi equals?
No, calculus.
Oh, great.
Newton and Leibniz. What is it called?
The fundamental theorem of calculus.
So,
the fundamental theorem of calculus.
Calculus, standard calculus. It's 17th century. There's integration, integrations.
Differentiation.
Yeah. Sir Isaac Newton in England and German philosopher, mathematician, Gottfried Wilhelm with Leibniz. They didn't know that the other guy was writing. Essentially discovered the same thing, formulated two different ways. So you have that. That's possible when the conditions are ripe for something. There is a deeper explanation. How was this possible? Actually, when you read that four men, three of them the same year published the books, and the fourth one 8 years later in isolation, working in America, not knowing about the existence of the previous three. How was that possible? You can see actually that if you look carefully in the entire history of price theory, you will see that there are a variety of people who were already hinting at the marginal utility theory, from the 16th century Spanish scholastics, actually, who were very close on the verge of discovering marginal utility. You have Malthus and Ricardo already applying some kind of quasi-marginal utility theory, diminishing returns and so on. Then you have, in the 19th century, a couple of German economists who were already on the verge of discovering the principle. And then Professor Huerta de Soto, a Spanish economist, discovered that there was one Catalonian Spanish guy, also in the early 19th century, prepare the ground for this. So the conditions were ripe, actually. The economic science as a whole was just all ingredients, all the elements are already here. So then those four guys were the independent co-discoverers of the principle of marginal utility. So that's the essence of Karl Menger's theory. So you have the excerpts from his book Principles of Economics, the third chapter or the third part of the book. And it essentially contains a theories of say theory, price theory, essentially. That's what it is. Pricing utility. So what Menger did was essentially to connect together two things that were separated in classical economics that they couldn't explain. Concepts of use value and exchange value. Fact, the use value is the fact that we have positive preferences for goods and services, and exchange value is that those goods have market price. And what was the problem? The major problem was this, the paradox of value that Adam Smith identified first time. And that none of classical economists, including Mill, Ricardo, Malthus, Marx, and others, could solve. How come that some goods that have obviously higher use value, for example, water or bread, have a much higher use value, much higher significance for our well-being, have a zero or very low market price, very low exchange value, whereas some goods that are seemingly like luxuries or vanity goods, like diamonds, have an extremely high exchange value, extremely high market price. This is called paradox of value. How come things can have a very high use value and very low exchange value, or vice versa? This disconnect between the two. In other words, they didn't know how to derive the theory about market prices from individual preferences of people. So use value reflects our individual preferences. We like this more than that. We have a preference for that. They didn't know how to go from there to here, from here to there, from facts of individual, psychological facts of individual preferences to objective facts of objective exchange ratios or prices of the goods. So then segregated, you remember this Ricardian segregation of goods into two different classes. You have the class of goods that are reproducible, which Marx accepts. Those are industrial goods, produced goods, that you can explain, whose exchange value you can explain by cost of production or labor embedded into their production, and vanity scarcity goods that are exceptions and that cannot be explained by the theory of value. So essentially, you explain the exchange value with labor and cost, and when you cannot, you simply just throw the towel and say, okay, that's less important. Now, Menger and Jevons are not satisfied with that. So they try to reconcile or unify use value and exchange value. So maybe the easiest way to map the whole analysis of Karl Menger is to draw the four key categories, key uses. Categories of goods that are separated into economic and non-economic goods. And concepts of utility and value, being distinct, different only distinct. So, what do you think? How does he define the good?
You say that it's like there's a certain amount of it. It's like you use the comparison of like water and how.
No, we'll come to that. How he solves how his theory of value solves the problem of solves the paradox of value, water diamond paradox, the famous water diamond. But just as a matter of definition, what is a good? Because that's very important. Irrespective of whether it's an economic or non-economic good. And then the marginal utility comes in to explain the difference between economic and non-economic good. It's anything that has the capacity to satisfy our needs, or as he says, some other chapter that is not quoted here, anything that could be put into some causal connection with the satisfaction of our needs. A good is anything, any physical or virtual object in the world that we as individual human actors can put into some direct or indirect causal connection with the satisfaction of our needs.
Is that for economic goods?
That's a good. That's just a good is a good. That's before we distinguish between economic and non-economic. So, water is a good because it serves to quench our thirst. Food is a good because it serves to reduce hunger. A diamond is a good because it serves our goals of enjoying in vanity items, whatever. Car is a good because it serves in our minds so to satisfy our needs to move from point A to point B. Leisure is a good because it's a precondition for us enjoying in other things or meditating or reading and so on. So it could be put into some causal connection with the satisfaction of some needs that we have. We'll see also steel and aluminum are goods. How come they are goods? They're goods because they can be put into some causal connection with indirect causal connection with the satisfaction of our needs. So aluminum is a good, although we cannot use it directly to satisfy any of our needs, unless you're very weird and like to have the aluminum plates in your bedroom. They could be used as a part of airplanes and cars or other pieces of equipment and machinery and so on that then can be used to satisfy our needs. So there's another distinction here. So good is anything that has utility. Explanation of goods. Utility. Utility is the capacity to satisfy our needs. So viruses are not goods because they do us harm, most of them. But whether something is a good or not is not determined by objective characteristics of that good. So you see, this is the key switch. Already at the very first step, we have this key switch. Utility is something that is in our heads. A chessboard is a good for me, but for my 8-year-old niece, it's not good. It's just a waste. The same physical chess set, because in my mind, it can serve to satisfy my need for playing a beautiful game of chess. For her, that's just a piece of furniture that her strange uncle carries with him when he comes to visit her, instead of playing with her some other game, European football or whatever he wants to waste time on. Yes. So the same physical good the same physical object might be a good or not be a good depending on the individual state of mind and preferences in our ability to contextualize it, to put it in a context of the satisfaction of our needs, to perceive and exploit causal connection with a certain satisfaction. So it might have a capacity to satisfy our needs, but if we are not capable of exploiting this capacity, it won't be good. Or if we don't have a type of knowledge that is necessary to utilize it as a good, it won't be a good. So the oil, for example, is now a good. It used to be a waste. So my favorite example, you who took micro with me, remember I use this example all the time. In Texas in the early 19th century, if you struck a oil source on your land, the price of your land will go down. Why? Because it was useless then, it is very bad for agriculture. Oil is a waste that reduces dramatically fertility, agricultural fertility of land. Nowadays, you would be more than happy to start oil. Loss of agricultural productivity, small potatoes compared to the money that you get for oil. What changed? Changed our technological knowledge and recipes that we now can use. What used to be a waste and like a black waste, now it's a black gold because we can use it for the internal combustion engines and all kinds of other generators, energy generators. It's a useful good that could be put now in the causal connection with satisfying our needs for heating, our needs for baking bread, our needs for moving around, our needs to traveling via planes and so on and so forth. So a variety of our needs could be satisfied indirectly with oil. So now oil has a utility. So utility is subjective. And here's 466, says at the beginning, at the top of the page. In the final analysis, the importance we attribute to things of the external world. Only an outflow of the importance to us of our continued existence and development, life and well-being. So everything that has value, everything that we value in the world, everything that we ascribe utility to is useful for us only insofar as it satisfies our needs. See, value is therefore nothing inherent in goods, no property of them, but merely the importance that we first attribute to the satisfaction of our needs, that is, to our lives and well-being, and in consequence carry over to economic goods as the exclusive causes of satisfaction. So see, utility and value are connected. We will see how are they connected, but the key connection, primary connection is between goods and utility, that goods are objects that have utility, and utility is subjective. Okay, now value. Discussion of value, definition of value has to do with this distinction between economic and non-economic good. So what does he say about that? What is the difference between economic and non-economic goods? Here is the core of his solution of the paradox of value. Paradox of, let's say, counterintuitive market prices. Why diamond is so much more expensive than water? Joyce.
Does that have to do with like the amount available and the amount available and then like the need for it, or like the
it's so the value is a relational category. Value is something that arises in the relationship between our needs, I use the term a relevant unit of our consumption. He uses the term like a practically relevant quantity of the goods. That's a relevant unit of our consumption and the total stock of that good. That's what determines value. So the difference, so value is a relationship between the size of the relevant unit of our consumption. For example, what would be the relevant unit of our consumption of water? Typically a glass of water, or maybe 2 or 3 glasses if we are really, really thirsty. But in general, for our individual purposes, that's the size of our consumption. Maybe for other purposes, it may grow, might be greater. But for every single commodity and every single form of consumption, we can think of what would be the relevant smallest unit in which we measure our consumption. For air, air is a good because we need it in order to survive, to breathe. What's the relevant unit is how much you can, whatever the chemists and biologists would know probably, what is the cubic, what is the volume of oxygen that every one of us inhales and the volume of oxygen, of carbon dioxide that we exhale per minute of time. If we are not exercising strenuously in normal situation like this, I would be inhaling slightly more during the class because I talk more than you, but it's still relatively low as compared to the total supply. This is the key. It's the relationship between the relevant unit, how much we can consume, and the total stock and the total supply. So he has some examples here that he says why water is a non-economic good or a free good. How would you define it? With regard to this, with a reference to the basic definition that value is something that has to do with the relationship with the, of the relevant unit of consumption and total available stock. So what is a free good? The stock is unlimited? Not necessarily. It's never really unlimited. It might be unlimited with regard to our consumption, but it depends. It's relational. If our need for it is very small and the total available stock is, what does it mean to say average, whatever that might mean, it may be free. It may be a free good. What is the criterion of whether the good is free or not? Page 466 in the very next paragraph. A relationship responsible for the non-economic character of goods consists in requirements for goods being smaller than their available quantities. So this is his, what I call the relevant unit of consumption. He calls the requirement for the goods. So my requirement for oxygen is much smaller than the total available stock of oxygen. Thus, there are always portions of the whole supply of non-economic goods that are related to no unsatisfied human need. That's a kind of German professors speak for saying that there is a large quantity that is useless, that nobody needs. In this room here, all of us together, we consume maybe 1%. If we are left here for 6 hours, we're going to consume maybe 0.5% of the available supply of oxygen. But then there's 99.5% of the volume of oxygen in this room that none of us cares about or needs. Hence, no satisfaction depends on our control of any one of the units of a good having non-economic character. And from this it follows that definite quantities of goods subject to this quantitative relationship will also have no value to us. So that means that the consumption of a non-economic good is non-rival. There is no competition between us for any one unit of the good. There is simply too much for all of us that we don't need to compete for any one individual unit. It's non-rival. So non-economic goods are non-rival in consumption. So that doesn't mean necessarily that the quantity of that good might be huge. Very often it is, but that it is huge as compared to our requirements for it. Maybe you can memorize that. He uses that term. I use this relevant unit of consumption. He uses in other contexts the term practically relevant quantities. Practically relevant quantities that are relevant for us for our consumption. That's Menger's term, that Ben Bauer appropriates. That is practically relevant for our realistic behavior in the world, not theoretically available or theoretically necessary quantities, but practically relevant quantities, whatever it is. 1 bottle of water for me daily is a practically relevant quantity pertaining to my consumption of water. As the available quantity of water is almost infinite, well, then the price of water will be very, very low, or as compared to other things, or zero, depending on the circumstances. So then he goes on with a couple of examples. This example with different trees. He illustrates the difference between economic and non-economic goods, free goods. Then why not? That's why the non-economic goods are free, because we don't have to compete. There is enough for everybody. As you have 100,000 trees in a forest, and you need only 100 trees for your annual needs. If 1,000 burns down, if the forest fire burns down 1,000 trees, you don't suffer economically anything. Your ability to use trees is not limited in any shape or form. You're not worse off as a timber consumer as a consequence of it. However, if there are only 10 fruit trees in the forest, and you need all of them for your annual needs, then losing one of them will force you to sacrifice some of your needs. That's the concept of value, the concept of price are related to the concept of sacrificing, choosing, losing something, trading something off, and so on. So if you have 10 trees and you need all 10 of them, and you lose one of them, you will have to sacrifice something. Some of your needs that you use those trees to satisfy will have to be eliminated or sacrificed. So you see, both economic and non-economic goods have utility. So air satisfies our needs. Timber that we don't have to pay the price for could be equally used to build houses as the timber that we have to buy from a private owner. Water that we drink on a brook and water that we buy bottled water have the same utility, the same capacity to satisfy our needs. So that's both economic and non-economic goods have utility, but not only economic goods have value. Non-economical free goods are valueless, which means that we don't have to sacrifice anything else in order to acquire one additional unit of that good. That's what it means, that something doesn't have a price, exchange value. Well, you just breathe, and you don't have to. You're not in conflict with anyone else. So then how does this solve the paradox of value? It solves the paradox of value by showing that what is relevant for the exchange value, for the price, is not the absolute quantity of the good that exists, and is not also the strength of our preferences for it. It's rather this relationship between a relevant practical unit of consumption and total available stock. The reason why diamond is very expensive and why water is very cheap, in most cases free, is that the relevant unit of diamond consumption is much greater, far, far greater as compared to the total available stock of diamonds. Then the relevant unit of water consumption is to the total available stock of water. So then the way how you solve the paradox of value is by going from treating goods as an abstract classes of good, water, air, timber, diamonds in general, to treating them as discrete, limited quantities, incremental additional quantities. Okay, that's the value is a category that emerges in a situation when the available quantity of a good is not enough to satisfy all of the competing needs that people have, that one individual might have, or that multiple individuals in society might have. Only those goods that are so short in supply vis-a-vis our needs for them have value. So they have value, and then they have a market price in the second step here, or the exchange value. So we don't trade in air and water because there is enough for everybody. Why would we be losing time on that? But we trade in timber and aluminum and laptops and books and so on, because they use the resources that are necessary, that could be used in more than one way. So we as individuals have to make choices what to sacrifice, and we as a society have to make choices for which particular purposes, which particular needs to satisfy with a limited supply of our goods, and which particular purposes to go without, to sacrifice. So the phenomenon of value involves always a sacrifice and the trade-off, and a situation where the total available stock is not enough to meet all the needs that we have. So economic goods have value. And another concept here, probably I missed, scarcity. So economic goods are scarce. Scarcity doesn't mean that there is a relatively little something. Scarcity means that there is relatively short supply for all needs that we have. It's a relational category. So economic goods equals scarce goods, equals goods that have value, equals goods that have exchange value or price. So you go from utility and scarcity, value, price. Essentially, interplay of utility and total available stock. This is the key. Like scarcity, as I can say, utility and availability, quantity. Utility plus availability define scarcity, whether something is scarce or not. Air is not scarce because availability is more than enough to satisfy all our needs, to maximize our utility. If there is a scarcity, then the good has a value. That something has a value means essentially that something else has to be sacrificed in order to acquire one more unit for that. And if something has value, it means that it will have market price. So market price is a monetary expression of value that we find in modern advanced economy, in which people trade goods and services for money. But you have value also in a barter economy. I won't give you my marker for free if I will ask you for something in exchange. If a marker was valueless to me, I would give it to you for free. So free or economic. So value doesn't mean necessarily the existence of market price. Of course, you need a monetary economy in order to have a price. But you see, this is a praxeological, philosophical, psychological, however, ontological basis for the entire economics. This part up to here, from utility to value. This is where the price is coming from, where the phenomenon of prices is coming from. It says on page 467. And non-economic goods, therefore, not only do not have exchange value, as has previously been supposed in the literature of our subject, but no value at all. That's what I'm saying. Non-economic goods have no value because they don't have alternative uses. Every unit we have more than enough units of it to satisfy our total demand for it. And hence use value. I shall attempt to explain the relationship between exchange value and use value in greater detail later, when I have dealt with some of the principles relevant to our consideration. For the time being, let it be observed that exchange value and use value are two concepts subordinate to the general concept of value. Okay? Later on, utility is the capacity of a thing to serve for the satisfaction of human needs. And hence, provided the utility is recognized, it is a general prerequisite of goods character. That's a prerequisite of goods character is the utility, that we recognize that some object has a utility. So the goods character of oil was recognized only when an internal combustion engine was invented. Non-economic goods have utility as well as economic goods, since they are just as capable of satisfying our needs. That's what I say. But what distinguishes a non-economic good from a good subject to the quantitative relationship responsible for economic character is the circumstance that the satisfaction of human needs does not depend upon the availability of concrete quantities of the former, but does depend upon the availability of concrete quantities of the later. So he wants to say that the one single unit is irrelevant with non-economic goods. No particular need depends on having any one individual units with non-economic goods, whereas with economic goods, we have more units of consumption that we can think of, or more units of utilization, more ways to use every available unit than we have units available. That's scarcity. We have more ways that we can think of how to use steel than the available quantity of steel. That's why we have a price of steel, because their high-rise building construction companies have to bid against the car companies or tank manufacturers or airplane manufacturers for the limited supply of steel. Okay, any questions? Any comments? Okay, page 474. You have marginal utility here. We'll come back to this table on the page. Can you tell me page on the table on the page 471? Can somebody try to interpret that? What is that? What is this table all about? It kind of expresses the principle of marginal utility in a complex one. So you have 10 different needs, 10 different goods that serve our satisfaction of our needs in different ways. It demonstrates the principle of marginal decision making or incremental substitution. It means that the goods are not abstract classes. We never ask the question, do you like more, whatever? Is food more important than smoking? He uses, of course, late 19th century, smoking was politically correct, tobacco. It's never the question of abstract comparisons between two different classes of goods or two different classes of satisfaction of our needs. It's on the margin, how many units. So here, number one is food, the most important need for us. Let's classify that way. And then you have number 10 is the first unit that you would use. Offers you the highest level of satisfaction, and then you have in descending order. Every additional unit offers you less and less satisfaction, because every additional unit serves to satisfy the less important needs. You eat one, whatever, loaf of bread to maintain your physical life, and the second unit in order to strengthen your health. And he says after a while we enter the area of diminishing returns. Eventually the consumption of goods becomes neutral. You don't get any additional utility out of it. And eventually, even if you go still further, you may get negative utility. You may get sick if you consume too much. So he says 10 units actually. After the 10 units of food consumption, however you define it, you're at zero utility. But then you have the second good, and tobacco is number 5. And you see now tobacco, the first unit of tobacco would offer you satisfaction which is similar to the 4th or 5th unit of food consumption. Which means that your total consumption will be always traded off will always take into account marginal preferences for different goods. How many units? You will not wait, in other words, to satisfy 100% of your preferences for food. You will not buy 9 units of food while buying nothing out of other possible consumption goods, 10 of them. How far you will go? You will go first unit of food, and then you will buy the next 2 units that you will buy would be the second unit of food, number 9, and whatever the drink, number 2, good. The first unit of drink. See, because they have the same value to you, 9 in this arbitrary numbers. So then depending on your total income, you will try to create an equilibrium between your different wants by purchasing different quantities of those different goods that corresponds to their relative marginal utility. The relative utility for you of 1 additional unit of every one of them. So he says then the tobacco, after the 4 units, if you just look at tobacco and food, those are the 2 only goods that you consume. After the 4th unit, 10, 9, 8, 7, after the first 4 units of food, you will buy the first cigarette pack or whatever. And then you will buy another 5th unit of food and so on. So this demonstrates the principle of marginal utility, that our decisions about how to, and now imagine that all of those units, to simplify, just to show you how this works, imagine that every 1 unit of all the goods has the same price, $1. And imagine then that you have $25. So how many units of which good are you going to buy here? If you buy, if you want to maximize your total utility, all 10 goods, you have to buy all 10 goods. So it would be a subset of those goods, and then you would for first unit of food, then 2 units, 1 unit of drink, good number 2, you can see that, and the second unit of food. So those would be $3 for 3 units of consumer goods, 2 units of food and 1 unit of drink. Follow? You follow me? So everything costs, every single item, every single number is 1 more unit, and every unit costs the same $1 in order to simplify the calculation. Then the next 2 would be 8, those who have the value of 8. Next 3. The first unit of the good number 3 may be clothing. The first unit, blue jeans. First blue jeans. Then the second drink, and the third loaf of bread. See? And so on down the line. And once you exhaust your entire income, whatever it is, $25, that's what you have. This is the description how we economize, how we spend our money on. What are the principles that drive our consumer behavior? This is theory of consumer behavior. It shows how consumer behavior is based on 2 things. Remember microeconomics, total income and individual preferences. Marginal utility of different goods. So how high? Now you can do one more thing. You have all those 10 goods that are classed in this way. You can create one single value scale. Let's say This is value scale. Number 1 would be the first unit of food. This 10 food. The quantity, the first unit. And what would be the second one? Let's say the second unit of food. And number 3, the first unit of drink. And so on down the line. So you can now recreate this value scale as one individual list here. Ordinal ranking. This is called ordinal ranking. And let's say that every one of the units here costs you $1. So then how are you going to spend your money? You go through your list, which is based on your individual preferences. Nobody can know whether you prefer the third unit of drink to the second unit, second pair of blue jeans, or the other way around. You go through, in your mind, through the first 25 units and say that's your consumption pattern will be determined by that. 25 units. The first 25 units will be satisfied. The first 25 needs that are used, that are satisfied by those 25 units will be satisfied. Everything else will have to be sacrificed because you don't have enough income for it. Okay. That's one principle. Second principle is the definition, page 474. This italicized paragraph is the key. So this is our example sacks of corn in Robinson Crusoe. The exchange value of a good or service or price equals marginal utility. That's now a strict definition. So in every concrete case of all the satisfactions secured by means of the whole quantity of a good, that means that you have a homogeneous stockpile of goods, which means a certain number of sacks of corn, each one of which is equally good, equally serviceable. You can use each one of them. They're equal in size, quality, and so on. By means of the whole quantity of a good at the disposal of an economizing individual, only those that have the least importance to him are dependent on the availability of a given portion of the whole quantity. Hence, the value to this person, this Robinson Crusoe, of any portion of the whole available, so the value of any one individual sack of corn, is equal to the importance to him of the satisfactions of least importance among those needs assured by the whole quantity and achieved with an equal portion. So that means the value for that person, that this person imputes to any one individual unit of the good, because they're interchangeable, they're the same sacks of corn, will be determined by the least important utilization of any one individual. So this is, remember, Robinson Crusoe and 5 sacks of corn and 5 different needs that he serves with 5 sacks of corn. And then we say the value of corn for Robinson Crusoe will correspond to the marginal utility of corn, which means to the value or to the satisfaction that he will have to sacrifice if he loses one unit, one sack of corn. So remember, food is number 1 utilization. Number 2 is seeds for the next harvest. Number 3 is feeding livestock. Number 4, making whiskey. Number 5, feeding birds for fun. And he has 5 sacks that he uses for, they're interchangeable, they're equal, so they can be used equal for all of these 5. If he loses one of them, what is he going to sacrifice? How is he going to rearrange his activities to adjust to the new situation in which he has now only 4 stocks?
He's going to get rid of lots of them.
Yeah, he was going to get rid of feeding birds. That's the marginal utility of corn, is the utility of the provided by the least important use, least important utilization. And imagine that he has 4 sacks of corn, and he acquires the 5th one. How is he going now to adjust his activities? He's going to add the same thing that he subtracts, that he eliminates from his pattern of behavior when he loses 1 unit, he will add his pattern of behavior when he acquires 1 additional. So in both cases, the value of any one individual unit is determined by the value of this marginal need, this 5th need. Utility of the marginal need is the marginal utility, and it determines value. It determines value. So then, the value will be greater when you have 4 units. Why is value greater? Because if you lose another one, marginal utility is higher. You will have to sacrifice a more important need on your individual value scale. This is making this just obviously more valuable than feeding birds for fun. And vice versa, as the supply shrinks, as the total stock shrinks, marginal utility increases, the value of the remaining stock. Every one individual unit of the remaining stock increases. And vice versa, when you increase the number of units, the value of every one individual unit will decline because the marginal need is less and less important to you. That's decreasing marginal utility, declining marginal utility that we know from microeconomics. This is the first time in history when the principle was formulated. This is history. This is literally the invention. This is a scientific discovery. That's the principle of economics. If you can find the book for $10, $15, and you can download it online for free as a PDF. I highly recommend it to you. It's probably one of the best textbooks. It's slightly awkwardly written, or maybe translated, because German is difficult to translate into normal languages, including English. So it sounds a bit like these long, convoluted, broken sentences and so on. But so that's the basic principle of marginal utility here. And it connects, you see, it connects the use value and exchange value. Right around. So marginal utility is what determines how scarce something will be. The price. Price is an intersection between available quantity and marginal utility. So marginal utility becomes the key component of price theory. Price will be higher, all other things being equal. Price of a good on the market will be higher the marginal utility. It's more desperately people desire one additional unit of something, higher the price for the total stock of that good will be. And vice versa. Lower the marginal utility, lower the price will be. So now there is no contradiction anymore between the use value and exchange value. You use the utility to derive essentially exchange value or price from it. You saw this table. There's different utilities of different goods ranked according to your individual preferences. And their exchange ratios, how many of which you are going to consume, depends only on your individual preferences. This is not the complete price theory in terms of the exchange ratios on the market. That's a separate issue. We'll study that with Ben Bauer next time. So this is still value for an individual, economizing individual. How an economizing individual exchanges with himself different quantities of different goods. So I exchange 2 units of food for 1 unit of drink and so on, or I'm going to acquire 1 unit of that instead of 2 units of that. The principle of marginal utility is the principle underlying my decision making. We'll see with Ben Bawerk actually how then the objective prices for all goods and services in an intersubjective context, people cooperating together and exchanging, how the prices I can say prices are intersubjective expressions of value. Which means all of us value something, and then how much we as a society value it will be determined. We will see that that's the supply and demand schedules and supply and demand analysis for the market. That's a more complex issue, but it just follows from this. This is the core of everything. Then everything else follows from that. You will see that eventually, if you remember from micro, if you're taking macro, something I repeat this in our analysis, that you can interpret the demand curve for the market that is co-determinant of the price is the marginal benefit, marginal utility curve, essentially. And the supply curve is the marginal cost curve, opportunity cost curve. So essentially, you can derive both supply and demand schedules and supply and demand curves from this thing here. You don't need anything in addition to it. That's marginal utility, marginal decision. So see how far-reaching, how fundamental this shift is. That you, instead of talking about labor cost, sorry, we're already out of time. People, be a little bit more assertive. When I go too much over time, just say, stop it, for Christ's sake. Final. Okay, we haven't finished Menger. A couple of things remain. We'll go to Ben Bawerk next time, and we will. It's okay because Ben Bawerk will cover what's left to talk about in Menger. Ben Bawerk will cover the same ground. Okay, sorry.
No worries. No problem.